So yeah, just assume his seat is.
What'd you say?
Just talk into
Just in this one? Testing. Is that good? Like this? All right, folks. We are going to reconvene. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kevin Binning. I'm one of the co-organizers of the conference here, assistant professor at Pitt. Our next speaker is one of our keynotes, and it is by Jenny Crocker. When we were planning the conference, we wanted to, the theme of the conference is theory and mechanisms. So one of the first things we did is, well, who's written important papers about theory and mechanisms in the affirmation literature? And we immediately thought of Jenny's work, and one of her papers in particular on the mechanism of affirmation being other-focused emotions. So when participants were affirmed, they felt greater sense of love and connection. And that then in turn mediated the effect of affirmation on an anti-smoking message. But as most of the social psychologists in here know, Jenny's much broader than just but studies more than affirmation. And so we thought it'd be perfect to kind of help broaden and kind of give us more depth to our discussions today to invite her, and she graciously accepted, and we're very pleased to welcome Jenny Crocker.
Thank you, Kevin, and excuse me. Thank you for having me here. I love to talk about the ideas that I'm excited about, and it's a pleasure to be here. And it's been a lot of fun to think about what I have to say on this subject, because I haven't done a self-affirmation study in about 10 years. So, but I do have a lot of thoughts about it. So, I think that one of the reasons that I'm really interested in this research, and have been really since I read Claude's work 3 decades ago, is that it addresses something that is an issue that is dear to my heart, which is the problem of the self. So the self isn't only a problem. The self obviously is a gift. There's many things we do, like planning and self-regulation and so on, that we couldn't do without a self. But the self also can seriously get in our way. So I just pulled out, actually these quotes come from the cover, the jacket cover of Mark Leary's book, which he titled The Curse of the Self. And can you hear me if I step away from the microphone? It's okay? Yeah, so I've got this lavalier, but I wanted to make sure you could hear me. So what Mark wrote is that the mental apparatus that enables us to be self-aware is the same one responsible for most of the personal and social difficulties we face as individuals and as a species. And he wrote that the egocentric, egotistical self blinds people to their own shortcomings, changes their relationships, damages their relationships, and leads to social conflict. Self-reflection distorts people's perceptions of the world, leading them to make bad decisions on biased information. It also conjures up a great deal of personal suffering in the form of depression, anxiety, anger, jealousy, and other negative emotions, and even leads people to put the demands of their egoistic self ahead of their own personal well-being. So I think that nicely captures something about the self that I don't know that there really are very many social psychologists who would disagree with these claims about the potential downsides of our unique human capacity to mentally represent ourselves. In my own work, I would frame it more as a problem of self-worth, right? That the issue is really, it's not that we have a self, but it's that we have self-esteem and that we get caught up in the pursuit of self-esteem. So a colleague and I wrote that the high of or feeling of safety that accompanies a sense of self-esteem or a boost in self-esteem is short-lived. Consequently, the pursuit of self-esteem becomes a never-ending quest. When we take a long-term and more global perspective, the costs of pursuing self-esteem are clear. And paradoxically, from this perspective, self-esteem is optimal when we're not pursuing it, not trying to get it, protect it, or increase it, when it's not on the radar screen or the ultimate goal of our current activity. This perspective leads us to ask how we can shift from pursuing self-esteem to pursuing goals that are more likely to lead to the satisfaction of our fundamental human needs, and what we can do to support others and ourselves to make this shift. So I view self-affirmation research through this particular lens of the problem that the self and our preoccupation with self-worth creates for us, and what might the solution to that be. So I think there are two pressing questions that preoccupy me. One is, why is it that we're so preoccupied with our self-worth? And the other is, if it is a problem, what's the solution? I think that self-affirmation theory is focused more on trying to answer the second question, or addresses better, at least, the second question than the first. In my reading of Claude's work and the work of other self-affirmation researchers, it begins with the idea that the self can be a problem, that our need to protect our sense that we are valuable, valued people with self-integrity is the starting point. And then what we can do about it is kind of what is addressed by self-affirmation research. So for me, the kind of first really amazing paper I read on self-affirmation theory was the Advances in Experimental Social Psychology paper that Claude published in 1988. I hope you don't mind this photograph.
It's the date that I'm more familiar.
So self-affirmation theory had three simple propositions. One is that cognitions that threaten the perceived integrity of the self, that is, its moral and adaptive adequacy, arouse a motive to affirm the self, to reestablish a perception of global self-integrity. Two, the motive for self-integrity can be reduced by behavioral or cognitive changes that reduce the threat or the perceptions of threat, and or do not address the threat but restore the perceived integrity of the self. And the means of self-affirmation will be determined by availability, that is, the degree to which a given adaptation is accessible in the individual's perception, memory, or imagination. So one way we can deal with potential threats to the self is just by solving the threat, right? Addressing the threat directly. But self-affirmation research, and I think the thing that was so exciting and influential about this paper is that self-affirmation theory proposes that we don't have to address the threat. We can resolve the threat or restore our self-integrity by affirming something that is in a completely unrelated domain, especially if it is more important than the thing that is threatened. So I love this work. I do think we have tons and tons of evidence, and I'm not going to even attempt to try to summarize it here, showing that it works. That is, not every study, it doesn't work in every single study, in every single situation, but we have hundreds of studies showing that this very simple manipulation, usually a manipulation in which people affirm or the standard paradigm in my mind anyway is that people rank order from a list of values, which are most important to least important, and then usually you have them write a paragraph or so about why that value is important to them. And having people do this seems to reduce the problem of the self for people. It makes people less defensive, less feel like they have to affirm the self in some other way. It makes people more open to information. So I think there's no question that this is a tool that has really remarkable benefits and consequences. What's been more problematic, I think, all along is the question of how it does it work. That is, what is the mechanism for self-affirmation research? And there have been many, many proposals across time. So here are, and I realize this is an incomplete list. It's not based on a reading of everything that has been published in this literature. Clearly central to Claude's formulation of self-affirmation theory is that there is this need for global self-integrity, right? So I'm putting that at the center. And this has been interpreted or translated into things like benefactance. So this is the idea that I am a competent and moral human being, self-worth, self-esteem. So the early work trying to pin down a mechanism focused on these particular constructs. It's also been proposed that self-affirmation manipulation simply trivialize the threat. So I put that in blue because it's sort of a cool mechanism. The red are hot mechanisms, the blue is a cool mechanism or cooling mechanism, and the pink is a warm mechanism in my view. So positive mood has also been proposed as a mechanism. I don't know if this has been in the literature, but the idea that maybe elevating affect, feelings like awe that produce this feeling of elevation may be a mechanism. And then what I've proposed in the past is that it's positive other-directed affect. It's not just any old positive affect, but these feelings of warmth and connection and love, empathy toward other people are what accounts for the effects of these manipulations. A sense of belonging. This is an ambiguous construct in my opinion, and I'll come back to that later. Steve Spencer has proposed that it's producing open-mindedness, working through open-mindedness. Dave Sherman has talked about decoupling the self from the threat, right? That's a cooling thing. I can cool this hot threat off by decoupling it from the self. Reduce stress. Again, Dave Sherman and his collaborators have shown effects on the catecholamines. Self-resources. So Dave has a 2013 paper that mentions lots and lots of these mechanisms, so he's well represented here. He's proposed that self-affirmation increases the resources that people perceive are available to them to cope with threats. And perhaps what it does is remind people that they have other sources of self-esteem, or produces a broader perspective on the threat, or elevates people's construal levels, right? So you perceive the threat in a more abstract way, and that's accounting for the effects. And I've used the term self-transcendence to describe what's happening as a function of these manipulations. So as I was thinking about this talk, I was thinking that, you know, if you back up here, in a way this is an embarrassment of riches, because, you know, from going to, you know, feeling like we don't have a mechanism really, we're now in a place where we have a lot of mechanisms, maybe too many mechanisms that are too different from each other to really know what is this manipulation doing. And I think it's important to know what it's doing and how it is working, because if we want to use this tool in new domains, it's important to know what is it we should be trying to accomplish. And if we don't want to be wedded to one particular paradigm, there was some talk this morning about maybe we need to do self-affirmation in different ways for different populations, right? We need to really be clear in our minds about what is the mechanism in order to know what other kinds of ways of doing self-affirmation would have beneficial effects and for whom. So that brings me to this possibility that we're a bunch of blind men in a room feeling something, and in this case it's the parable of the blind men in the room with the elephant, where different people have access to different parts of the elephant, or they're touching different parts of the elephant, and coming up with very different conclusions about what's going on, what the mechanism is. So maybe there is an elephant here that we're not seeing because we're focused on specific mechanisms and not seeing the big picture. And that's what I want to propose today. In fact, I want to propose there are two elephants in the room that may be capturing different ones of these different mechanisms. So I want to back up in order to describe what these two elephants are. I want to back up to this question that I think self-affirmation theory doesn't take on as its project, answering the question of why the self is a problem. And I'm going to argue that the self is a problem because it is scaffolded onto a system called, by some researchers, the self-preservation system. You may more frequently have heard this called the fight or flight system or the stress system. It's a survival system, right? This is a physiological system that evolved to promote survival in the face of threats to our physical well-being. So it's a system that mobilizes biological resources to facilitate adaptive responses to opportunities, challenges, and threats to physical well-being or survival. It facilitates the delivery of energy to muscles and inhibits non-essential biological processes such as growth, digestion, and reproduction via the fast-acting catecholamines and slow-acting adrenocorticoids. So it's a biological process to enable us to both run away from the threat. I had an experience last year when I was at Stanford going for a walk up behind the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences and came across a big snake that looked to me like a rattlesnake. And I had this response, right? This physiological, I could have said, oh, that's an interesting looking snake. Let me get out my phone and take a photograph. But I was out of there, right? There was a physiological response that energized me to cope with the perceived threat, and I was out of there. So that's what this system facilitates. But I think it's often, maybe usually overlooked, that this is a system that also mobilizes resources to deal with opportunities. So cortisol, for example, is highest for most people early in the day and declines across the day. So this isn't just a threat system, it's an opportunity, challenges and opportunities system. And this system is evolutionarily very old. Clearly, we human beings have this system, but the snake that I encountered also has a system. It has a self-preservation system. The snake will attack or slither away or lie still if it doesn't feel threatened, right? So this is something that has evolved over many evolutionary eons in order to facilitate adaptive responses to challenges and opportunities that are related to our individual survival. However, it's also kind of a social mechanism in social species, particularly primates. Robert Sapolsky, in particular, has done a lot of work looking at how this stress response or stress system, self-preservation system, can be activated in primate hierarchies. So, and it's not just the dominant or just the submissive individual in a group that experiences this activation of the stress response. It really depends on the stability of the hierarchy and different forms of behavior in different primate species. But we know that this system can be activated by social relationships and not just by physical. I mean, social relationships can be threats to our physical survival and well-being, for sure. So, but it can be activated by social cues. So people are not snakes, and they're not even chimps, although we may be closer to them than we like to believe. People are, above all, cognizing beings, right? We have social cognition, as many decades of research have shown us. So first of all, we have self-awareness to a degree that at least we don't know that any other species has. we're capable of mentalizing. That is, we think about what is the mental state of another person. What is another person thinking about and perceiving, and how are they feeling, and what are their goals? We think about how we are perceived by other people. So we see ourselves as objects in the eyes of others, and we realize that other people have perceptions of us. And we think about how other people affect us and our ability to achieve our goals. And we think about how we can affect other people and their ability to achieve our goals. And we think about how we can affect how other people perceive us and vice versa, right? So these are very complicated cognitive capacities that humans have to a degree that no other species does. And with these cognitive capacities layered on top of this very fundamental, deep-rooted motivational system to survive, right? We get human social motivation that I've called ecosystem motivation. So first of all, it's scaffolded onto the self-preservation system. That is, it's using and activating the same biological processes as the self-preservation system does. It's focused on satisfying our individual needs and desires, and particularly responding to social threats and taking advantage of social opportunities. So in this system, other people are viewed as either means or obstacles to satisfaction of our own needs and desires, or else we just don't care about them. We maybe even don't see them as people, right, as human beings. They're irrelevant to us. Or else they're a means for me to satisfy my own needs and desires, or they're obstacles that get in the way, and I've got to do something about it. So the characteristics of this system are, first of all, interpersonal goals. So one of the key interpersonal goals, and the one that we kind of have operationalized this system with, for better or worse, is the goal of image management. That is, if I view other people as means or obstacles to satisfaction of my own needs and desires, then I better be able to present myself to other people in a way that will either encourage them to help me get my needs met, and that could be by presenting myself in very positive ways, but sometimes it could even be by presenting myself as weak or needy or vulnerable or fragile, right? There are different self-presentations that can elicit support from other people. They don't have to be positive. And of course, we can also appear tough and ruthless, willing to attack any opponent, anyone who stands in our way. And that's another image management strategy that can help us get our needs and desires met when we perceive other people as obstacles. We haven't directly studied attention, but we have some findings in my lab that suggest that people with this motivational system activated are focused on what events mean for, they're asking themselves the question, what does this mean for me or about me, right? Everything is about me. If my colleague down the hall wins an award, what does that mean about me? Am I not as good as they are, right? So this kind of everything is interpreted through the filter of what things mean for me or about me. We do have a lot of data showing that when this system is activated, people construe interpersonal relationships in zero-sum and competitive terms. That is, they tend to think that what's good for one person is bad for another. They're in competition with other people for resources, and they feel their affect is kind of competitive. The emotions that characterize this system tend to be self-conscious emotions, of all sorts, both pride and shame and embarrassment, and I guess that'll be good enough. But also we find that even without an event happening, in their interpersonal interactions, when people have this ecosystem motivation activated, they report feeling afraid and confused and conflicted and pressured and isolated. That there's this kind of negative emotion that's separating and somewhat tense and unpleasant for people. Again, we've seen that, in the very first study we ever did and continue to find those effects. A finding that's quite recent and accidental, so we haven't published it, and I don't know if we'll pursue it, but really to rule out an alternative explanation for an effect. David Lee, who was my postdoc at Ohio State, was interested in who gives support that actually fits another person's needs. And what he found is that people with self-image goals have a regulatory mode, and this is Tori Higgins's construct of assessment. That is, they're really primed to evaluate themselves and other people. And again, we suggest that this system activates the self-preservation system. So fortunately for human beings, this is not the only system that can motivate us in our social relationships. There is an alternative motivational system that also has its biological roots in an evolved motivational system. This time, it's the species preservation, or what other researchers have called the caregiving system, or there's a variety, different researchers in different subfields call it by different names. But this is the motivational system that facilitates nurturance and protection of others on whom our evolutionary fitness depends. So all mammals have young that are born too immature to take care of themselves. The species would not be preserved. The species would die out if we didn't have a motivational system that energized behavior to care for our young, right? So this is kind of the very basic evolved need for the species preservation system. So this is a system that facilitates the development of social bonds. It's regulated by hormones such as oxytocin, vasopressin, and progesterone. It's evolutionarily more recent. I don't believe that snakes have a species preservation. They're little baby snakes, just go off and survive by themselves. But all mammals have the species preservation system. One thing that's interesting about this system is that when it is activated, it has the capacity or the ability to downregulate the fight or flight response to threats. That is, it downregulates cortisol. In fact, oxytocin is a cortisol antagonist. So when these two systems are both activated simultaneously, up to a point, the species preservation system can downregulate the self-preservation system. And this makes sense, right? So if you're the mama lion on the plain and a predator comes along, you need to protect your young, right? And so you need some system that can downregulate the response, the very evolved response to run away from the threat, right? To protect the self. You've got to protect your young, but only up to a point, because it doesn't make sense to, throw yourself into the jaws of the predator to protect your young, because your young will die anyway if you're not around, right? So there's a trade-off here between these two systems, but it does seem that the species preservation system can downregulate this fight or flight response to threats. So in human beings, again, with our very high levels of cognitive capacity, our ability to think about ourselves, other people, the relations between ourselves and others, how we affect others, how others affect us, I call this system ecosystem motivation in social relationships, and it's scaffolded onto this species preservation system, focused on the promotion of the well-being of others, promoting the well-being of others and not harming them, responding to others' needs. So other people's needs are seen as important in their own right. In the ego system, we only care about other people's needs if we need to address them to get them to help us, right? So, but in this system, other people's needs are seen as, if not equally as important as our own, at least also important. And it can be activated when we're reminded, so this is where I'm really going out on a limb here, I think it can be activated anytime we're reminded of something we care about outside ourselves. So people not only care about other people, we care about people around the world, right? When there's a tsunami in the Philippines, we'll give millions of dollars, right, to aid those tsunami victims who don't share our location, they're not in our neighborhood, we'll never interact with them. They may be a different ethnicity, they're a different religion, right? We have this impulse to respond to threats to the well-being of other people in a pro-social way. But we also have this impulse to respond in a pro-social way to threats to other things we care about, like institutions and organizations, and even ideas, right? The idea of democracy, the idea of fairness, the idea of equality or liberty, right? These are ideas that inspire us to act, right? So I think that in human beings with our very amazing cognitive capacities, this species preservation system can actually be activated in a very wide range of circumstances. All right, so the characteristics of this system, I have no idea what time it is. Characteristics of this system are, first of all, the interpersonal goals, and this is how we typically operationalize the activation of this system, is when people say they have the goal to be supportive of other people in general or a specific other person. They want to be constructive in their comments, and they want to do no harm. So their attention is focused on what is it that other people need. Their construals of relationships, this is a point we have a lot of data on and have published, is non-zero sum. That is, they don't view satisfaction of other people's needs as meaning their own needs and desires will not get satisfied, right? They think it's possible, at least, to find solutions to problems that are good for everybody. They feel cooperative with other people. The emotions that characterize people when this system is activated, they report, again, over and over, they feel calm, peaceful, clear, connected, loving, right? So these emotions are not high arousal positive emotions. They're calm, low arousal positive emotions that are directed toward their relationships with other people. And again, in David Lee's work, accidentally, we found that they are pretty strongly associated, a correlation of about 0.4, with the regulatory mode of locomotion, which is really kind of about being ready to act, wanting to do something. So there's clearly an action aspect of ecosystem motivation. It's not just, I care about the planet. It's, what am I going to do about it? Right? What action can I take? It's priming people to act. And again, I think that this activation of the system activates the species preservation system. One thing that's, I think, really important about this framework is that we don't view these at all as opposite ends of a single continuum. In fact, they're two separate systems, and they can both be activated or neither can be activated, right? So as the example of the species preservation system down-regulating the self-preservation system, I think that when people focus on what they care about beyond themselves and what they want to do about it, it can down-regulate ecosystem mechanisms. So we have a little bit of data we haven't written up for publication yet, but it shows up in several studies where when people have compassionate goals towards others, it downregulates that negative affect that's associated with the ecosystem, right? So even when they have self-image goals, they don't have as much of that fearful, afraid, confused, conflicted affect that in their social relationship. So you get a downregulation of the negative affect. So we know that this system reduces stress. So Jim Abelson, Thane Erickson, and a whole team of people at the University of Michigan and the Department of Psychiatry did a study using the paradigm of the Trier social stress task, which I assume that most of you have heard of. So this is the task that the psychological task that most reliably activates the stress response in human beings. So people are brought into the lab, and they're told they have to give a speech. In this study, they had to give a speech and then count backwards by 17s from some ridiculously high number. And as soon as they made a mistake in the counting backward, they had to start over again. And they were encouraged to hurry up as they were going through the task. So that's all after they give a speech. In this case, it was a job interview. They were told they were going to give, and they had 5 minutes to give a 5-minute speech and 3 minutes to prepare for it. So in this study, which differs from a lot of the Trier social stress test studies, we have central cortisol. So it's not just collected from saliva, but actually central, which seems to be important to get at what's actually the core physiological processes, rather than, saliva in the mouth can have cortisol without necessarily reflecting activation of the stress response. So in this study, so it took about 2 hours. There had to be a nurse present for all of these participants, and there were 3 experimental conditions. One was just the standard instructions people are usually given in the Trier stress task. In another condition, they were given kind of a coping instruction, which was the idea that, look, you can, you're going to do this. People find it sometimes uncomfortable to have a panel of evaluative judges kind of looking at them while they give their speech, but you have the opportunity to close the curtain so they can't see you. Now, nobody did, but they knew they had that option as a way to deal with the stress of the task. And then in the third condition, they were given a compassionate goals intervention. They were told not to worry about how they appeared to other people, but really try to focus on what you want to give if you get this job, what you could contribute to the company, what is the difference you'd like to make, and what do you feel passionate about if you had this job. And what we found, because I'm a co-author on this paper, this with the line with the diamonds is the data on, so this is ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is part of this cascade of the stress response. And this line is the line in the standard instructions. So I've just walked in front of a lot of people, but you can see, so this is the minutes relative to the start of the task. So these people are in the lab getting ready. This is the ending of the speech. This is the ending of the full task, because they did that arithmetic task also. And you follow them for 60 more minutes after the task ends. And you can see that we get the standard bump in ACTH in the standard instructions task, which is good. And then we also have this coping condition, and actually the coping instructions actually seem to increase ACTH. This group is significantly different from the other two. So they start out high in cortisol, or ACTH, it starts to drop, but then they go back up, and then they decline over time after the task ends. What's most interesting for me is that in this compassionate goals intervention condition, it's just a flat line. You don't get the cortisol response to the Trier social stress task. And in a subsequent paper, Thane Erickson, there's lots of data about possible mechanisms. So we don't know, and there are lots of possibilities. You don't know just from looking at this graph, is it really that their goals shifted? But in fact, in follow-up analyses, Thane has shown that it is the goals that seem to mediate this effect, and not a bunch of other potential mechanisms that mediate this effect. So we have lots of other effects of this manipulation. I don't want to take time to go through all of the methods of all these studies. So I'm just going to hit the conclusions for you. So in most of our studies, we measure these goals rather than manipulate them. So that gives you an idea of what the measures look like. These are just sample items from our measures. And we know that when people have compassionate goals, they're become more responsive over time to their college roommates. Their roommates perceive that responsiveness. It's not the perceived responsiveness that predicts changes in self-esteem, but rather being responsive to your roommate directly predicts increases in your own self-esteem. It's not that your roommate is responsive to your needs, but that you're responsive to them. These goals also predict change in your partner's esteem for you. So when people have compassionate goals, they become more responsive over time to their roommates perceive it, and the roommate's regard for them increases over time. Here's some of our data on positive affect. When people have compassionate goals, they report feeling more cooperative with their roommate. So this is more compassionate goals than they usually have. That day, they feel more cooperative than usual, and they feel more at ease and connected when they're interacting with their roommate. We also get the effect in a lagged analysis, looking from day to day. Compassionate goals build social resources. Ecosystem motivation builds social resources. So these are data from a different study in which we measured responsiveness. And what we found is that when people have compassionate goals, they're more responsive to their partners. I think I actually have a pointer here somewhere. Their partners, maybe not. Their partners are more responsive to them. Their partners perceive their responsiveness. The partners become more responsive in return. The partner's relationship quality goes up, and their partners develop more compassionate goals back toward them. Resources for coping, we have data on that compassionate goals predict decreased depression and anxiety, increased growth orientations, optimism, and felt security. These all work through the interpersonal relationship processes, right? They're mediated through processes like support, given and received, responsiveness. Those are the two key interpersonal processes. So I won't talk you through that. So let me turn to what the implications of all of this are for self-affirmation research. So in thinking about mechanism, first of all, I think that we have so many mechanisms in the literature now that we need some higher level framework for thinking about what are the kinds of mechanisms and what are those different mechanisms doing and how do we get to them. Mostly my sense of the literature is that when people have looked directly at self-esteem or self-worth or implicit self-esteem as mechanisms of self-affirmation research, they either get very small effects or they don't get them at all. That is a kind of explanation that just hasn't taken off, even though it's been around probably the longest. And we know that things like success and praise have very fleeting effects on people, right? That you feel high after you get a letter of admission to graduate school, but we have data showing that that high goes away within a couple of days. And in general, I think self-esteem tends to be a bottomless pit, right? So it's kind of what's the next thing I have to do to demonstrate that I am a person with worth and value. So I think that ecosystem mechanisms for self-affirmation research, it's not that they're wrong or that you can't find them, but they're likely to be relatively small and not very enduring. On the other hand, I think the ecosystem mechanisms are getting more support. They provide sustainable gains for the self. And I was going to show you some data. This is positive other-directed affect. So we did a values affirmation study in which just the basic paradigm, rank order your values and write a paragraph about your most important value, or for people in the control condition, why that value might be important to other people. And we just ordered them in the paper according to how big was the difference between we had people rate a bunch of different affects, and how big is the difference between those two conditions. And you can see that on feeling love, we have a huge difference. Joyful, giving, empathic, connected, sympathy, grateful. Right? So all of these things are showing really big differences between the values affirmation and the control condition. And what doesn't show any effect is selfish, scared, sad, confused, and angry. So in fact, in that paper, just because I was so amazed, this is the distribution of how those ratings are for the specific feeling of love. So in the control condition, by far, the most frequent rating was not at all, right? 1, on a 1 to 5 scale. I don't feel love when I write about my most important value, my least important value, and why it might be important to others. And then it kind of tails off. Nobody says they extremely feel love. But in the values affirmation condition, people feel love, right? This is the most frequent rating on that specific emotion, and it tails off so that we have maybe 1 or 2 people who said they didn't feel any love at all after writing about their most important value and why it was important to them. We also did a study trying to get at this idea by having people affirm 2 different types of values. So Leah Burson did a study in which people affirmed, we called them self-transcendent values in the paper, but they're really based on our ecosystem theory. So when people affirm values related to being responsive to other people's needs, being empathic, being the relationships they care about, we found some interesting effects. So affirming those kinds of values produces more positive affect than affirming self-enhancement values, which produces more positive affect of the, than affirming no values at all. In that study, we started out by socially excluding people. So people did this paradigm where they're going to work with, there's 3 people in the lab, and they all have to choose who they want to work with on the next task, and our subjects never get chosen, right? So they're socially excluded, or they're in a control condition. And then they do the values affirmation task, and then we put a bowl of sort of disgusting little, I think they were Chips Ahoy, or, tiny little Chips Ahoy in front of them, and counted how many cookies they ate. And people who were excluded in the control condition ate 8 cookies on average. They were not excluded, they ate about 4 cookies on average. If they did the self-enhancement values, that reduces the number of cookies they ate, and the least number of cookies were eaten by the people who affirmed self-transcendent values. So, but what was interesting in this study is the emotions did not mediate the effect. In the previous study, we measured defensiveness to an anti-smoking message, and the emotions clearly mediated the effect, but in this study they didn't. So it suggests that it's not only about the positive emotions. So I've tried to, just working on this talk, tried to think about, well, how are we going to think about these different mechanisms? So here's our 2 elephants. We have the global self-integrity, which most of the time people think about it as being connected to self-worth and self-esteem. And we have my preferred elephant, which is ecosystem motivation. And then we can try to sort the different mechanisms out according to which system they may be working through. So benefactance, self-worth, self-esteem, those I think are all about self-integrity and should be ecosystem mechanisms. Trivialization, it's just a cognitive mechanism that doesn't have to do with either system. I think positive mood, elevating affect, and positive other-directed affect are here. And in fact, when we look at ecosystem motivation predicting positive other-directed affect, we get an association even when we control for overall positive mood, right? It's not just positivity, it's a specific kind of positivity. Feelings of belonging, what I don't like about this construct as it exists in the literature right now is that it's not clear about if it's about me and I belong here, or if it's about something larger than me or that transcends the self. And I can create a sense of belonging for other people as well as myself. So I think it's often construed in a kind of ecosystem way, but we have evidence that compassionate goals actually create a sense of belonging. Open-mindedness, that's a sort of neutral cognitive mechanism. Decoupling, I think, is interesting because it's sort of cooling off the ecosystem, but maybe it's something that happens when you get all the way to activation of the ecosystem. Reduce stress, again, cooling the ecosystem, maybe activating the ecosystem, maybe doing it through activating the ecosystem. I don't know what just came up. I should look at the screen. Having a broader perspective, I'm not sure about whether that's just a cognitive effect that's sort of neutral, could go with either system. Construal level, I do think is neutral. You can have high-level ecosystem construals and high-level ecosystem construals. Okay, so then, social resources. We've seen really clearly that activation of this system helps people to build social resources, like the availability of social support. So this framework suggests that there may be some other things we could look at, like whether we're viewing our relationships in non-zero-sum ways, the activation of compassionate goals, locomotion versus assessment, self-regulatory mode, and one that we've found in one study, but we haven't really followed it up. Is people, when they have compassionate goals, they report having a lot of goal clarity, and goal clarity may be really crucial to some of the self-regulatory effects of values affirmation. Whereas goal confusion may be accounting for some of the difficulties people have when their self-integrity is challenged. All right, so just a few conclusions. I think instead of searching for the specific mechanism or viewing these mechanisms in competition with each other, we maybe could think about the constellation of features of ecosystem and ecosystem motivation that may increase or decrease defensiveness and other kinds of self-affirmation outcomes. And it suggests to me that maybe one approach to intermeaning is to help people identify and articulate some kind of noble goal or life purpose or North Star, or what is the direction in which you want to go? So where are you trying to be headed? And I think people can clarify that in the absence of threat and then access it in the presence of threat, right? As a way to think about, well, do I really want to smash my TV after watching Donald Trump? Or is there some direction I want to be the starting point of taking things in the direction of? So we can start to explore factors that make it difficult for people to develop clear ecosystem goals. For example, there's some research that suggests that childhood abuse and neglect or childhood trauma, there may be certain oxytocin alleles that make it more difficult for people to access ecosystem goals. And we can also create social contexts that support and value ecosystem motivation. And probably the most effective way to do that, to encourage ecosystem motivation in other people, is to have it in ourselves as we interact with them. So in several of our studies, we find contagion of this motivational system through these interpersonal processes. So we can foster ecosystem motivation in other people by embodying it in ourselves. And then I just want to say, I hope you don't interpret this talk as a critique of self-affirmation research, which I love, but rather as offering for your consideration a different way to think about what are the mechanisms of this really amazing manipulation, this really amazing tool in all of the research. And in fact, I think that the problem of the self is definitely a problem of ecosystem motivation. The solution is values affirmation, or that's one solution, which activates ecosystem motivation and downregulates ecosystem motivation and sustainably strengthens self-worth. Our self-esteem findings are over 3 months. Whereas focusing directly on bolstering self-esteem can backfire. And I think that the idea of sustaining the integrity of the self is entirely consistent with what I've been talking about today, and that shifting to ecosystem motivation may be the most effective tool we have for sustaining the integrity of the self. All right, I'm done. Thank you. We might have
We got time for a couple questions, yeah.
All right, David, go at it.
Thank you, Jen. I'm glad that you kind of moved from the first question of what is the mechanism to kind of concluding with what are mechanisms, plural, or what are a mechanism or several mechanisms. Because when I've thought about this, or when my students and collaborators have thought about this mechanism question, it isn't really clear what people don't really define what they mean by mechanism either. It's what are people in the field, or people who kind of are interested in this, thinking about. The way that I've been thinking about this is to try to understand the connection between what goes on in the independent variable, the input, what goes on in these wide range of outputs, grade, performance, stress level, openness to new information, and then what are the different mechanisms at different levels of analysis that could explain the effects both in the short, immediate term, after someone engages in an affirmation, and that could sustain that over time. So there's different mechanistic stories that you can tell depending on what your focus, what a researcher's focus is. So I think that broadening the conversation to focus on the wide range of mechanisms that could help understand the wide range of effects that people in the field have been observing is a great kind of contribution of this perspective.
Thank you. Yeah, and what I'm trying to do is organize it so we can think about at a more abstract level what are these various mechanisms kind of tapping into. David.
Yeah, so what I'm taking it from your talk here is that you want us to shift away from this ecosystem idea to more of an ecosystem idea when thinking about the self. And I keep thinking about some early analyses we did looking at self-affirmation writing in the context of breast cancer survivors. And so this was back in 2007 when we published this. It's been a little while, but one of the things we did was we looked at how people affirm themselves in the context of expressive writing. And what you see is something like 80% of the self-affirmations that we coded in there were about relationships. So it really fits with the kind of ecosystem model that you're proposing. But then we also looked at all the other domains, so affirming the global self-concept, which is very ego, thinking about how good I am as a person in terms of managing this breast cancer diagnosis. When we did these regression analyses, certainly relationships affirmations really drive a lot of the effect. But when we look at these other domains in terms of affirming the self, it added predictive strength in terms of predicting. In this case, we were looking at reductions in physical symptoms. And so I'm sort of struck by, this kind of either or scenario you're proposing.
Yeah, and I kind of lapse into that language, but I don't think about it as either or. And in fact, I think that, boosts to self-esteem, they're definitely helpful to people, right? So reminding myself of, well, you might not like this paper or grant proposal, but I've done lots of good work. But that's, as I said, that it's a kind of bottomless pit. Once it keeps people kind of stuck in the question of, am I a person of worth or not, right? So, and I think that's you can fight that battle every minute of every day of your life and end up exactly where you started out, right? So I just see that it's not effective in the short term, but I don't think it's a long-term strategy for people. But it clearly, we know that boosting self-esteem boosts positive affect, and probably makes people a little like, I can relax for a few minutes, right? But then tomorrow they've got to do another thing that proves how great they are, right? So, and the other thing I've noticed, and this is completely anecdotal, I once did a little values affirmation exercise in my graduate class on the self. And everybody's like, oh yeah, I guess, I get it. Except for one student who said, yeah, family is my most important value, and I feel terrible because I'm not spending any time with my family. So he was kind of stuck in the self-evaluation framework, the assessment mode. And I think that's actually a danger of this paradigm if we're not really clear how it can work and how it can not work, is that values are something that we can very easily go into judgment about, right? Who's upholding the value better than who else? Am I doing it better than my spouse is doing it? And when we're in that mode, I don't think it's helpful for reducing threat. I think it just feeds threat. So it's not that I think the ecosystem, I think those ecosystem mechanisms are ecosystem mechanisms for values affirmation studies, but they're not as sustainable. Claude.
What the idea of what your cells differ in terms of how they're composed, if I can use that term loosely. So, and you're kind of self-evaluatively accountable to the things that you've internalized and identified with that are really important to you. So you could see person A being really identified with family and church work and community work, and person B being really identified with achievement and individual progress and so on, success. So there'd be two different selves there. And I'm wondering how you incorporate that in your system, because you could say the sort of moral and adaptive adequacy standard could be applied to both people, but they'd be applied in different ways. For the person for whom the self it's very internalized to be a good family member, as your example points out. They're not going to feel good about themselves unless they're doing something of that sort, and maybe the strictly success and ego accomplishment kind of things wouldn't be very affirming to them.
So,
and a lot depends on how the particular self is constructed and the accountabilities that it holds the person to.
But it's all about what I care about, right? And I'm not saying that people who care about family or their community are ecosystem people, and people who care about achievement are ecosystem people. That's a mishearing, or I misstated it if I implied that. Because I think in any domain, you can be about how good am I? Am I achieving? And that focus is on the self, right? It's about judging the self. Or you can say, regardless of whether I'm any good or not, is there something I want to do to contribute to the well-being of a person or thing or organization that I care about, where the focus is not on the self, right? So I believe, my personal belief is that regardless of the specific constitution of the self, anybody can be in either motivational system. And in fact, we all are in both motivational systems many times in every day, much less in our lives, right? So we go in and out of, oh, that was a really good talk. I don't know if my talk can be as good as that, to, oh yeah, maybe I have something to say that could be helpful here to somebody else. And it's not about, was my presentation perfect, but is there a difference that I want to make? Am I inspired to make a difference, right? So the domain, in my opinion, really doesn't matter. It's the way we approach that domain. We can judge ourselves or, and be preoccupied with whether we're good enough in that domain, or we can focus on what we want to contribute and create for other people.
Wouldn't that latter be ego relevant? If I
No,
care about
not
it?
if we're judging. If we're judging, but I don't think so. If it's focused on,
I mean, I could give a lot to other people, and it would have no significance for my own.
well, we see it does have indirect effects, making people, so it leads to positive mood, it leads to higher self-esteem, more regard from other people, but that's not the goal, right? So there are these kind of unintended indirect effects that are actually sustaining the ego, right? But if you're going after, okay, I'm going to prove I'm the best mom on the block, or, my husband's mother had a neighbor who wanted to be a really good person, and so she baked cookies for the old people, and she brought them around whether they wanted them or not, right? It was totally disconnected from what the other person's needs were. It was all about, she was proving what a good person she was. And I interpret that as ego system motivation.
So I think we have to cut off because
Sorry.
we're about like 10 behind.
I know there's a
But
lot of-
This will come up again in the panel later, so we'll have plenty of time to continue on with this, and thank you so much.